In this series, we bring you the stories of ordinary people whose lives were touched by extraordinary circumstances. On a cold winter's day in Beijing in 1906, a child was born who would live a life more extraordinary than almost any in modern history. His name was Aisin Gioro Puyi, and though he could not possibly understand it at the time, he had been born into a dying world. The Qing Dynasty, the ruling dynasty of China for over 2.5 centuries, was crumbling. Foreign powers were carving up China. Rebellions were shaking the empire's foundations. And the last of the great Manchu emperors was growing old and frail. Puyi was not the first in line to the throne. But fate and the will of a formidable woman changed everything. That woman was Empress Dowager Cixi, the real power behind the throne for decades. On her deathbed in 1908, she named the 2-year-old Puyi as the next emperor of China. Just one day later, the sitting emperor died under mysterious circumstances. And so, in a ceremony glittering with gold and steeped in ancient tradition, a toddler was carried into the Forbidden City and placed on the dragon throne. He could barely speak, let alone rule, yet in name he became the Son of Heaven, ruler of the Middle Kingdom. The most powerful man in China, at least on paper. A throne in a storm the empire Puyi inherited was already falling apart. For centuries, the Qing had ruled with an unshakable belief in their divine mandate, but the modern world had little patience for emperors. Across China, revolutionary forces led by Sun Yat-sen were rising. Western ideas, democracy, nationalism, and industrialization were spreading. In 1911, when Puyi was just 5 years old, the Xinhai revolution erupted. The dynasty's armies faltered, the provinces declared independence, and within months, the Qing court had no choice but to surrender. The boy, who had been emperor for only 3 years, was forced to abdicate. But here's the twist. Although Puyi was no longer emperor, the new Republic of China allowed him to stay inside the Forbidden City. He would live there as a virtual prisoner of tradition, the head of a vanished empire, the last of the emperors, surrounded by eunuchs, concubines, and a crumbling ceremonial court that had no real power. The gilded cage inside those towering red walls, Puyi lived in a strange, frozen world. Every day was governed by ancient rituals. He was addressed as Your Majesty, dressed in silk dragon robes, and served elaborate imperial banquets. Outside the palace gates, China was modernizing at breakneck speed. Trains, telegraphs, Western fashions. But inside, time stood still. This would change when a tall, soft-spoken Scotsman named Reginald Johnston became Puyi's tutor. Johnston introduced him to bicycles, tennis, photography, and the English language. The young ex-emperor began wearing Western suits, reading Shakespeare, and daydreaming about life beyond the palace walls. In 1924, the fragile arrangement collapsed. A warlord named Feng Yuxiang marched into Beijing and expelled Puyi from the Forbidden City. For the first time in his life, the 20-year-old had to step into the outside world. A life interrupted, then hijacked. Though he had known privilege and comfort for most of his life, Puyi was now completely out of his element. Without the protection of the Qing court or the Chinese government, he feared for his safety. So he did the only thing he could think of. He contacted the Japanese embassy and asked for asylum. Soon enough, he was on a train bound for Tianjin, where Japanese officials offered him a deal: renounce your claim to the throne, and become an ordinary Japanese subject or remain emperor of a new puppet state in Manchuria. It was a bold gamble, but one that paid off. Before long, he was the titular emperor of a new Japanese client state called Manchukuo. But The prestige of the new title could not disguise the reality. While living in relative luxury in the capital city of Xinjiang, Puyi was under constant surveillance by Japanese secret police. They monitored his phone calls, opened his mail, and even bugged his bedroom. Any independent action on his part was impossible. Any attempt to escape would surely end in failure. And so he played the role assigned to him, meeting visiting dignitaries, attending lavish state banquets, and presiding over the puppet parliament. But no matter how diligently he followed his script, he was nothing more than a figurehead. All real power was held by Japanese military leaders. Even his wife and children were seen as pawns in a game much larger than them. One son was sent to study in Japan, while the other was betrothed to a Japanese princess in an attempt to cement the alliance. But such strategic maneuvering could not alter the bleak reality of the situation. The great game was on, and Puyi was caught right in the middle. War clouds gather. In 1937, the clouds of war broke over China. When Japan launched a full-scale invasion, the entire political landscape changed. As Chinese resistance stiffened, the Japanese tightened their grip on Manchukuo. Soldiers occupied government buildings. The secret police became even more active, and restrictions on Puyi's movement were tightened further. The imperial palace became more like a prison. Late-night telephone calls to his family in Beijing were forbidden, and he was often summoned to the Japanese headquarters to scold him for failing to rally support among the Chinese population. But how could he? Throughout his life, Puyi had been a reluctant player in a game controlled by others. First, the Qing court, then the Japanese. How could he suddenly turn the tables? He tried to protest, to make clear that he was no more than a symbolic ruler, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. By 1945, the war situation had become dire. As the Red Army advanced, the Japanese presence in Manchuria dwindled, and the fabric of the puppet state began to fray. Facing defeat, the Japanese High Command ordered the evacuation of civilian personnel, leaving the deposed emperor and a few loyal courtiers to fend for themselves. The fall. Again in August, as the Red Army entered Chongqing, Puyi fled south by train. When the locomotive broke down near the town of Yilan, he attempted to escape by air. But his plane was spotted and strafed by Russian fighters. As smoke poured from the damaged aircraft, Puyi and his entourage fled into the forest, where they were captured by Soviet troops. Taken to Siberia, he was held as a prisoner of war for 5 years before being handed over to the newly established People's Republic of China. Many expected him to be executed as a traitor. Instead, Mao Zedong's government sent him to a re-education camp in Fushun. There, the former emperor, who once commanded millions, was made to sweep floors, till fields, and study communist ideology. At first, he resisted. But over the years, something in him began to change. He learned humility. He confessed his past mistakes. He even admitted publicly that he had never truly been in control of his own destiny. Anew, beginning on October 17th, 1967, at the age of 61, Puyi died of complications from cancer. His death marked the final chapter of China's imperial era. A legacy of contradictions. Puyi's life is a story of contradictions, a boy crowned in splendor, who spent most of his life powerless. A man caught between ancient tradition and modern upheaval, a symbol used by both monarchists and revolutionaries. He was the son of heaven, and a pawn of others' ambitions. He ruled an empire, and yet never truly ruled at all. And perhaps that is why Puyi's story continues to fascinate, because in his rise and fall, We see not just the end of a dynasty, but the human cost of history's relentless march forward.